The second discussion of today, which is Tangled Webs, the Internet's Infrastructure. This panel will address the material structures that make the Internet possible, the history behind it, and the sociology and the politics associated with it. Samanth Subramanian will be in conversation with Usha Raman, who's the moderator of this session. Usha is the former professor of communications at University of Hyderabad, and she has done multiple studies on the cultural and social impacts of digital media. With that, I'd like to request Usha to kindly take this discussion forward.
Thank you, Anusha, and welcome everyone to the second session in this stream. I must begin with an apology or an explanation. There were supposed to be 3 people on this panel, 2 people plus me, but Apar fell victim to the problems of Indian Airlines and his flight was cancelled, so he couldn't make it. So Apar Gupta, as many of you may know, is the founder of Internet Freedom Foundation, and Samanth Subramanian is a journalist who covers many things, but I think one of his primary focus areas has been science. And his latest book, the title of the session is Tangled Web, but his book is called The Web Beneath the Waves. And our original discussion was supposed to look at the material infrastructure as well as the regulation of the internet and the data flows that go through the internet. But in the absence of Apar, we've modified the session somewhat, and I think Samanth's book is itself actually a very rich exploration of that part of the internet that not many of us are really aware about. So, and especially in recent times, we talk about the internet, the cloud, data centers, and so everything we think of about the internet seems to be above ground or in the air, even though we haven't actually created data centers in space yet. But then when you look at the history of communication more broadly and specifically the internet, you find that the infrastructure that it actually rests on goes, much deeper than the Earth's surface. In fact, the old cables that handle telegraph, telecommunications, are the same pathways that now carry internet traffic, most of or all of the internet traffic. So Samanth's book and his most recent work really looks at this very material infrastructure that the internet rides on, and I think it's a fascinating exploration because it took him to parts of the world that not many journalists actually go to. So I'd like to begin by asking you how you came into this story and what piqued you about it. Was it something that I know I have a little bit of insight into that, but maybe you can tell that story. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I have to begin with 2 apologies. One is that I'm fighting the mother of all colds, and so I will constantly dab my nose. Photographers, please don't capture that. The second is that this book is actually not out in India yet. It'll be out in April, so unfortunately you can't buy it right away. I apologize for that. But my lawyers tell me that your attendance at this session constitutes a binding agreement to buy the book when it comes out. So just be warned, we will serve you legal notices later. This book actually had its genesis in one way sometime around 2012 or 2013. I had stumbled by accident upon a very long essay that the science fiction writer Neil Stephenson wrote for Wired magazine in the 1990s. The essay was 40,000 words long, so longer than my book, in other words. And it was published in Wired, and it was called Mother Earth, Motherboard. And it was the first serious attempt to look at what the terrestrial and undersea infrastructure of the burgeoning internet at the time looked like. And Neil Stephenson kind of follows around the world the laying of, at the time, the longest undersea cable in the world, which is called FLAG. It was a fiber optic link, and it was kind of making its way from the UK all the way to Asia and beyond. And he kind of lands up in all these weird places. He calls himself a hacker tourist in the book. And it's his excuse to travel to various parts of the world and talk to people who lay these cables and repair these cables and plan them and finance them, and kind of really examine what this map of cables looks like and what it says about the internet that is emerging at the time. So I'd read that, I remember I just bought an iPhone. It was an iPhone 3, and there was an app on it called Instapaper, which some of you may remember, and I'd saved the article to Instapaper, and I was reading it at home on my phone, and it was so interesting that I had to go to the shop to buy some groceries, and I kept reading as I was walking there and kept reading as I was walking back because it gripped me so much. It was my first window into this, the back end of the internet, so to speak. So that happened around, as I said, 13 or so years ago. And then 3 or 4 years ago, I read in the newspapers that this country called Tonga, which is an island nation in the South Pacific, had experienced this massive undersea volcanic eruption. And the eruption had severed its one international undersea data cable, the one cable that connects Tonga to the rest of the world, and had plunged it into a kind of digital blackness. And when I read this, I thought back to the Neil Stephenson essay, and I thought, look, 25 years plus have elapsed since Neil Stephenson wrote that essay, and the internet is so much more central and pivotal to our lives. What does his world, what does a world of Mother Earth, Motherboard look like in the 21st century when the internet is necessary for everything? We kind of, and maybe we'll get to some of this later, which is just the surprising and astounding ways in which we are reliant on the internet. But I wanted to know, I wanted to know sort of who controlled the internet these days, who controlled the laying of this infrastructure, which companies were around still, what was different then, what was the same. And so I set out in a way to kind of answer these questions for myself. I pitched this, initially I talked about this as an article, but the newspaper I was talking to said, look, we can't fund the travel that this requires, you'll have to go to a publisher. So then I found a publisher who was willing to foot the bill for my jaunts around the world. But essentially I wanted to be a hacker tourist just like Neil Stephenson, but in the 21st century. So I spent about a year and a half, not all of it, but off and on, traveling to places like Tonga and Taiwan and Singapore and the Ivory Coast, Madrid and California. It was an extremely exhilarating period of travel for me. And along the way, I kind of learned how the internet has changed and how its infrastructure has changed and who the big players are today. And the other thing also that happened was just as I was researching all of this, the world conspired to give me what you might call a newsy angle to the book, which is that countries started to become acutely aware of the danger of sabotage, of deliberate sort of damage inflicted upon these undersea cables. China cutting Taiwan's cables, Russia cutting the cables that run to the Baltic nations and to the Scandinavian nations, the US extremely worried about China's role in the undersea cable industry, the UK deciding that its undersea infrastructure was so valuable that now they have two military naval vessels just patrolling the waters endlessly to make sure that their cables and their oil pipelines that come ashore are safe. So suddenly this has become like an area of acute geopolitical interest as well. And so I think that was sort of the biggest change that I could record from the time of Neil Stephenson and that essay.
Yes, as you just noted, acute geopolitical consequence today. But I think one of the things you note in your book in the early pages is around how the infrastructure of the internet so mirrors, colonial pathways. And particularly the nations you talked about, have been key in voyages, they've been key in colonial expansionism and so on. And you also note that, in the past, these pathways were agents of globalization, multiple agents of globalization, but the internet and these undersea cables particularly now are the agent. I think that's the term you use, the agent of globalization. So if you can talk a little bit about this mirroring of, we talk about post-colonial, but clearly there is no post-colonial. So, could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. I mean, this is an exercise that all of you can do at home once you get back and get onto the internet, which these cables make possible. You can call up a map of telegraph lines from the 1850s or the 1860s, and you can call up the map of undersea cables today, and you can overlay one upon the other, look at one and then the other, and you will see how strikingly identical they are. They are basically the same. There's one key difference, which I'll talk about. And so this serves to, and then you read about the telegraph lines and so on, and it serves to remind us that the telegraph lines were, of course, an astonishing technological achievement at the time, but they were also first, conceived in part as an agent of imperialism, as a way for example, Great Britain to control her overseas territories. I make the point in the book that the telegraph lines that they laid were both an agent of imperialism, but also constituted by imperialism. And what I mean by that is, at the time, these telegraph lines were, of course, copper, but then they were covered in a kind of insulating material called Gupta percha. And Gupta percha is a latex that you tap from trees that were available in Malaysia, in the Malayan Peninsula. So the empire basically sort of extracted this latex, coated the telegraph lines in it, and then kind of ran these telegraph lines back to Southeast Asia and to other places to continue controlling those very territories and plantations and so on. So it's a reminder, I think if you compare these two maps, it's a great reminder that some of these pathways of power have not fallen away at all. The thickest swatch of cables then and now is the one that runs from Western Europe to the east coast of the United States. There are huge cables that run around the coast of around the tip of Africa, and of course, after the Suez Canal opened, there's a number of cables that run through that area and overland through Egypt as well. The one key difference between then and now is the thicket of cables that you see in Southeast Asia and the China Sea. And that is the one big sort of geopolitical change since then, which is the emergence of China and to a certain extent Southeast Asia as a huge economic powerhouse. And so that is reflected in the comparison of these two maps. So that is a visual kind of reminder of sort of what has changed. There is no sort of post-colonial, as you said. Maybe that you can make that argument. The other thing that you can look at is the companies that lay these cables, that continue to lay these cables. And until very, very recently, by which I mean 10 years ago, all the companies that laid telegraph lines and then coaxial cables, which carried our ISD telephone calls, and then fiber optics starting from the early 1980s. Until about 10 years ago, all of the companies that laid these were also either American or Western European. And so the control of sort of who got a cable and how, who was connected to the worldwide infrastructure of information, those decisions also rested in the hands of these companies and these entities.
Yeah, which brings me to the whole political economy of this whole thing, right? So we often talk about big tech, and we often talk about the 5 big companies or the 7 big companies that control the internet. And I'm wondering if those same players also have a role to play in the undersea cable, and who else then becomes a prominent player in that space.
Yeah, I mean, so to answer that, a very quick historical primer. So in the 80s, when the first fiber optic cables were being laid, and definitely through the 90s when Neil Stephenson was researching his essay, the prominent way to lay a cable was this. You want a cable from the UK to India, which would, or let's say to Singapore, which would stop in Portugal and then in South Africa and then in Saudi Arabia and in India and then go to Singapore. So the state-owned telecommunications agencies from all of these countries would get together and form a consortium, and they would put in money, and they would get sort of bandwidth according to how much money they've put in. And because they are state-owned, they have the rights to land these cables on their shores, so they don't have to apply for government permissions. And so these consortiums model were for a long time the default mode. Then in the 1990s, a lot of governments started selling off their state-owned telecommunications companies. There was a lot of privatization. And so what happened after that is a single investor or a pool of investors would come in. They'd say, listen, we're private investors, we'll kick in the money. We need to go to some government agency to acquire landing rights. So we'll do that. But beyond that, the government is not really involved. We'll lay the cable, we'll sell off bandwidth. And that also continued to happen. So, there were a number of private investors that did this. again, about 6 or 7 years ago, that also started to change. And what these players that in the telecom industry, they're called OTTs, but we know them as the big tech companies, and primarily four of them, so Meta, Google, Microsoft, and Amazon. These four companies whose the lifeblood of their work is data. And the amount of money that it costs to lay a cable from, say, Western Europe to the US, which is right now, let's say, $500 million. It's a lot of money, but it's not much money to these companies. So they saw suddenly that it made eminent logical sense for them to just fund a cable entirely by themselves, sell bandwidth if they choose to, control the whole thing if they choose not to. And it got to the stage where right now, 2 out of every 3 new cables are being laid by one of these 4 big tech companies. 2 out of every 3 new cables. And so the age of, definitely the age of state-owned companies laying cables is over, or for the most part. The age of these private investors is also, sort of withering. And these companies now, like they control so much else about the internet, they also control the backbones through which the internet travels. And that raises a huge number of questions, about data privacy, consumer rights, and so on. This was all worrying even 3 years ago when I thought to myself, it's 4 companies, profit is their bottom line, they can do anything. But in the age of Trump now, we are reminded again that these 4 companies are all American. And they are uniquely, I think, like more so than in the last 25 or 30 years, they are so much under the thumb of the American government now, that, they will do anything it takes to remain in the good books of the Trump administration or whatever government is in power. And so that also raises the question of, well, what does it mean that American entity is under sort of an American authoritarian regime control these cables? And the answers are not fun to ponder.
Yeah, in fact, just the other day, someone had reprised that photograph. Many of you may remember from the Trump inaugural of the 4-5 people next to him, all of whom were tech billionaires. And it's the same companies that own or are controlling the laying of these cables. And somehow it seems that our conversation these days tends to be about the soft factors of the internet, right? We're talking about content a lot. We're talking about social media and who should access it and who shouldn't, and should there be parental controls, and should children be allowed to access it. But I mean, those questions are extremely important, but it almost seems like this big thing that is happening under our seas and, in space probably, is actually going to be the thing that controls everything else. So I'm wondering if, where this surfaces, to use an undersea metaphor, where this surfaces in terms of people's use and how governments might regulate, keeping in mind the infrastructural aspects.
It's important maybe at the outset to clarify just how vital these cables are. Now, we all live in a wireless age, and we tend to think of mobile phones and Wi-Fi and so on. At a pinch, we think that, signals go from our phones to a tower, maybe to a satellite or whatever it is. But the truth is that 95% of all international data traffic is carried through undersea cables. 95%. And satellites obviously are important. Starlinks are important. At a pinch, when there's no connectivity anywhere and you can't lay a cable, Starlinks will suffice. But the volume of data that we consume right now is so huge that there is no way we can fill Earth's orbit with enough satellites to take up all that data. And I don't see any way, nobody sees any way of that happening in the foreseeable future, because our consumption of data is just so exponentially massive. So cables are crucial, vital. I mean, I made this point in the UK when I was talking about this book, which is that I told them if all the undersea cables around the UK got cut by some freak accident or act of sabotage, people would have no way to go home. They couldn't call an Uber because that would not work. They couldn't call their relatives because actually, believe it or not now, even landline phone calls are sometimes routed through or often routed through cables. They could not check their email, they could not check WhatsApp. Their buses would probably not work because there's like a traffic management system that relies on the internet. And the magic of the internet, the reason why it's in a way such an amazing thing is that it's not necessarily true that if you are in London or if you're in Hyderabad and you are sending a WhatsApp message to another person in Hyderabad, it will just all stay localized within it. The logic of the internet that is, it will route through the shortest, quickest point at that time. And that may well involve sometimes like pinging a server overseas and then coming back into the same country. Not always, but sometimes. And so, so that's how vital this is. And going to Tonga was a really eye-opening experience because Tonga is kind of like a perfect test case. It had one international data cable that snapped. So it was a country that, before I went there, I thought, okay, it's been thrown back to like the 1980s, to a pre-internet age. But actually, it's been thrown back to the 1820s, to a pre-telegraph age, because there is no other form of communication that they have. The most outlandish kind of story I heard about how much the internet affects people's lives is I went to talk to a woman on an outlying island, and she told me this story about how a week or so after the cable snapped, she found she had suddenly, the power went out on her house. And of course, the electric grid was out anyway because that also depends on the internet in some ways. But she had solar panels and she thought she was off the grid and she was very proud of herself for having installed them and so on. And then the solar panels went out. And she went up onto her roof and started checking and everything seemed fine, nothing was damaged. And then she realized that the panels were equipped to periodically check the internet for updates to the software. And if it did not get an update or it couldn't find the internet, it just bricked up, which is the problem that happens with Tesla cars and with so many other kind of smart devices in this day and age. If they cannot find that software update, they will just stop working and freeze up. So, and of course, there's so much other, banking stopped, essentially. You couldn't go to an ATM and withdraw money because that relies on the internet. You couldn't go to the bank and say, can you give me some money, because they can't access their accounts. For a while, when so Tonga is like an archipelago, and the bank on an outlying island stopped working entirely because the internet froze up. So finally, they got a Starlink link to the main bank headquarters on the main island of Tonga, called Tonga Tapu. But the outlying islanders still couldn't access their bank. So what the Tonga Tapu headquarters guys would do every morning is download all the account information onto a spreadsheet and a thumb drive, fly the thumb drive over to the outlying island. They would plug it in, conduct transactions all day, update the spreadsheet as needs be. On the evening, the USB drive would fly back, and these guys would update the main database so that they knew again the next morning how much money people had in their accounts. So this was a kind of like bizarre workaround that they had to undergo. The main sort of communication system on Tonga, apart from phone and WhatsApp, is Facebook Messenger. That died. But also, therefore, people who are conducting commerce through Facebook Messenger and on Facebook Marketplace in general, that stopped. So everything really just freezes up. Everything freezes up. And it's a weird paradox. I mean, Tonga could survive somehow, or kind of could find workarounds to this problem, because it is so much on the periphery of the world economy. But the other test case that I examined is the country of Taiwan, which has 15 cables that wash ashore international cables. And they're in a really precarious situation because on the east side, all the cables are vulnerable to Chinese ships that want to cut these cables in acts of what they call gray zone warfare. And on the west side is like extremely geologically active, and periodically they have underwater landslides and so on that cut these cables in a trice. And so if the island of Taiwan was suddenly taken off the internet map, I mean, think about what that means for the semiconductor manufacturing companies over there. Think about what it means for flights going in and out. Think about what it means for China to suddenly realize that their biggest foe is offline and can't defend themselves. I mean, and the Taiwanese are so acutely aware of this. The journalists are often kind of used to going to a government agency and saying, listen, can you tell me about your biggest fears? And the government agency clams up. The Taiwanese invited me to Taiwan saying, we need to talk about this because it's our preeminent existential threat. And I went there and I had these long conversations and so on. And the last question I asked them was, are you thinking about suspending publication of the coordinates of your cables? And what has happened for the last 150 years since the very first telegraph cable was laid, the policy is that you will be transparent about where these cables lie. And the reason for that is you don't want fishing boats or shipping anchors to accidentally cut the cables. So you publish it all, it's all in the public domain, the coordinates are well established. It's been the practice for 150 years. And the Taiwanese, for the first time in these 150 years, they're saying we're actually now actively thinking of taking that information off the public domain. And that kind of, and that really says something, the fact that they're trying to reverse 150 years of transparency because of the threats of sabotage in this way.
That brings me to this whole conflict about how we think about the internet, right? So these pathways, actually their functioning depends on openness and a certain kind of transparency and co-ownership. Traffic cannot be regulated in certain ways. But what goes on inside the internet requires regulation, I would argue. Many people would say, no, it shouldn't be regulated, but that's a point of debate. So how does one square these two ways of thinking about regulating this big thing that we have all come to understand as the internet, but then you realize that you really don't understand the internet?
So there's two aspects here, and I think, unfortunately, Apar is not here because he would be able to talk to the aspect of regulating the online world itself, the abstract notion that we know as the internet. I'm much less familiar with that. But the infrastructure of the internet is extremely interesting. And so the truth is, within the industry, everybody thinks that ever since the first fiber optic cable was laid, ever since the internet became a thing, governments have adopted a relatively loosey-goosey aspect to regulating internet infrastructure and the undersea cable world in particular. You require permissions to land cables on a country's shores, of course, and there's a regulation about what cables can do once they're on shore. But undersea, in deep waters, in international waters in particular, but there's no real law that applies. There is a UN Convention of the Law of the Sea, which is a very nebulous body of, it is a law, but nobody follows it, or it's very difficult to know who you would prosecute if something happened out in international waters. So it is by nature very hard to regulate, which the industry was very happy about. They said, look, everything is going perfectly fine, or had been going perfectly fine until the last few years, when geopolitical strife between US and China and so on started intruding. And they yearned for this time in the 1990s or the early 2000s when they were just a bunch of companies getting together and saying, let's lay a cable this way and we'll raise the funds, and that's all it is there is to it. So it was relatively unregulated in that sense. The actual regulation started coming in the minute the cable came ashore. And at that point, governments started wanting to get a sense of sort of what the data was and how you could snoop on it. I mean, I think we are all now very worried about government snooping on internet data, but I heard an extremely good story from somebody at Singtel, which is a Singaporean telecom authority. And the early 2000s, what happened was this: Singtel was laying a cable from Singapore to Madras. And this was a considerably advanced in technology over the previous cable that existed in terms of bandwidth. Just the amount of information that could flow through this new cable was vastly more than what was in the earlier cable. And for a year, the Indian government didn't allow permission for that cable to come ashore and be switched on. And the Singtel guys were completely confused. They didn't know what was going on. Until it turned out that the Indian government was just unsure about how to snoop on this vastly, exponentially more, exponentially bigger volume of data that would come through the new cable. So they had to take a year to figure this out and find, ultimately, some Israeli software to install on the landing station servers, so that they could then kind of snoop on the metadata that was flowing through the cable. So this has been happening for a long time. It happened in the Cold War with telephone cables, and it's happening now. And so that is that should worry everyone. I think increasingly, you will hear people say, look, if I send you a WhatsApp, governments can't snoop on the WhatsApp message itself. They won't know that I'm saying, let's plan an attack on the World Trade Center tomorrow. But they will know the metadata. They will realize that I'm messaging this person more than any other. They can kind of construct these profiles of us from what other websites we frequent and what else we do on the internet. So all of this is extremely worrying. Perversely, or conversely, I guess, there is very little regulation about what happens in international waters. So again, there's an example, I wish I had my book with me, but there's an example, a hypothetical example I have in the book, which is, look, if there is a terrorist attack out in the mid-Atlantic on a cable that has been laid, that is owned partly by Google and partly by another company, so American and say British, and that lands in 5 different countries along its route, and the ship that was carrying these people attacking the cable is flagged in Liberia, but is crewed by Indians and captained by a Filipino. Where is the jurisdiction? Who do you sue? Or which country is the one that does the investigating? Which court is set up to handle this kind of jurisdiction? Out in international waters, there is an alarming lack of regulation about how these cables should be treated. And so I think that's both these sides are sort of worrying for all concerned.
So do you see that those discourses coming together in policy circles or in regulation? Those who talk about regulating what we may, for want of another word, the soft aspects of the internet, the content, and those who want to or even imagine regulating the infrastructure.
Not even a little bit. I mean, I think even there is some talk about regulating the soft aspects, the online world. There is none about actual efficient and meaningful regulation of the infrastructure. The only regulation that is happening now is stemming from geopolitical strife. So for example, the US has basically outlawed any of its internet cable laying companies or repair companies from working on projects in which a Chinese company is involved. They have outlawed the purchase of cable manufactured by Chinese companies. They have banned cables running from China to land in California. Even though the internet traffic between these two countries is vast. But now if you want to lay a China to US cable, you have to first go through neutral jurisdictions like Singapore or the Philippines or whatever, and then come back up to California. There are at least 3 cables I know by my count that had to be just abandoned because these US regulations started to kick in. And Chinese companies were involved in these cable projects and they had to. So what is happening now is that there's a weird kind of small scale bifurcation of the internet. Because if you have to conceive of cable routes that run along popular routes, and the US cables won't allow Chinese companies to be participants, the Chinese have to lay their own cables along those same routes. It's a kind of redundancy that, redundancy in the tech world is a good thing, it's a backup. But this is not the kind of redundancy people are seeking. It's just needless expense because of this bifurcation of and people are worried about that in the industry as well. They kind of talk about the fact that as a result of the US's actions, the Chinese are now delaying permits to lay any cables through the South China Sea. And if you want to lay cables in Southeast Asia at all, the South China Sea is crucial. So it's that part of it, I think, it's really the first big direct intrusion of politics into this world of infrastructure.
So the next question is more about your approach to storytelling for this book as compared to your other works. So for those of you who may not be familiar with Samanth's work, his earlier books have ranged from Sri Lanka, post-conflict Sri Lanka, to a biography of JBS Haldane, to this. And each of them is very different, of course. And of course, the book about fish is the other one. But in terms of entry points, you would think that a geographical entry point like Sri Lanka or a personality like JBS Haldane leads you to an archive of a sort. In writing this book, where did you begin? I mean, of course, you did talk about Neil Stephenson, but that's the imaginative beginning. But where did you actually begin your research?
With almost everything I write, which includes the magazine pieces, but also the books, I mean, my first instinct is to look for people. Real human beings who do this kind of work are always at the heart of the stories that I want to tell, because I'm just curious about what it means to be a undersea cable repair guy. Like, what is that life? And my constant effort as a journalist is to put myself in the shoes of somebody else and see the world through their eyes. It's possible in more to some extent in biographies and so on, and much less in a book like this, where your central character is the cable itself, in a way. And the cable is not a very fascinating object. And so you have to kind of look around for other ways to make that interesting. Logistically speaking, the way I first started was I went to Madrid for 3 days and attended a conference in which there were a number of people from this industry who gathered and talked over 3.5 days, I think, about in various panel discussions about the various aspects of the industry. And they were very, very geeky people. I remember one Japanese professor whose son young son has started to mock him a lot, because every time he's on vacation on a coastal region, he wants to go to the beach and look for manhole covers where he knows that there is a cable coming ashore. So he'll kind of walk a beach in every coastal city he goes to, and his son kind of trails around complaining all the time. So, there were people at that Madrid conference who were just kind of obsessed with their work, which really fascinates me. And my next step was then to kind of track them around the world and kind of see where they work and how they live, and in the case of Tonga, sort of how they lived without the internet. But storytelling is a strange thing. I mean, I used to, and maybe to some extent I still do, I think, look, in my kind of field, you need a few key tools, which includes sort of the art of interviewing somebody or the art of like observation and so on. But once you have those tools, my theory is that you can go out and write about practically anything, almost anything, and try to make it interesting for a reader. But every book presents its own challenges. I mean, with Haldane, for example, which is my previous book, this is a British scientist who lived in the first half of the 20th century, an ardent communist, pioneering geneticist, who at some point actually moved to India and became an Indian citizen, died in Bhubaneswar, and his wife then came right here to Hyderabad to join an institution here and died here. So he had a great life. He was a fighter in the First World War. He was accused of being a spy by the Brits during the Second World War. He conducted research on himself all the time, and his father did as well. It's a great life. But that was a story that I had to tell purely through archival material. So my challenge there was, how do I present a life that is visual? How can I let the reader kind of see what Haldane's world would have been like at the time? What is it like to be in a trench? What is it like to be in a submarine? That kind of thing. With this one, it's a little different. I could go out there and see things with my own eyes. But let's be honest, once you've seen one data center, you've seen them all. It is just racks of servers in an air-conditioned room. There is nothing more romantic about a data center in Tonga than in Hyderabad or anywhere else. So the challenges there are slightly different.
Yeah, data center in Vizag, actually, not Hyderabad. But I think now we can open it up for questions. So if any of you have questions for Samanth, yes. We have one here, and one there. So we'll start with, okay.
She has a mic.
So I have two questions. One is about how do they lay the cables undersea, and the other question is with respect to the climate. Any kind of climatic damage after the cables are laid, especially after the Trump administration moving out of the climate.
Okay. How cables are laid, the answer is very carefully. These are very thin fiber optic cables. Some of the strands inside are as thin as a human hair. They are in deep sea waters, they are offered minimal protection. And so when you go out on a cable ship in deep waters, there is like it's a spool of cable that kind of is let out very slowly along an extremely predetermined route, and it kind of sinks to the bottom of the ocean floor on its own weight. There is one software and only one software that kind of is able to tell a ship's computer how fast to go, what route to take, so that this cable is laid along the route that was planned. So that is kind of computerized now to some extent, but otherwise is not very different from how telegraph cables were laid earlier. Similarly, the repair of cables is astonishingly 20th century or maybe even 19th century. if you think a cable is broken, or you know a cable is broken, you go out where you think it is, and then you toss a grapnel hook overboard and kind of drag it along the ocean floor, hoping that it snags the broken cable. Of course, you have some idea of where it is, but it takes like 2 or 3 or 4 sweeps until you snag the cable, bring it up to the surface and repair it. Exactly how it was done in the 19th century. So it's a little old school. And your second question was about climate. There isn't actually that much environmental or climate damage from cables. They're very thin. The ocean is vast. You lay them at the bottom of the floor and their lifespan is about 10 or 15 years. The only time environmental permissions come into play is when you are landing a cable on shore. And at that point, governments start to demand that you don't go through ecologically fragile areas and you land in places where, it causes minimal damage to the coastal ecosystem and so on. Yes, sir. Sorry, there's a mic right behind you, I think.
My question is, in recent Davos World Economic Forum, Bharti Airtel's chief Sunil Mittal said that India did not make much progress in the physical infrastructure, but we have made great progress in the digital infrastructure. And we are achieving growth and development through the digital infrastructure, and we have become kind of a role model for many of the emerging countries. But now that I hear you, how much of our digital infrastructure is actually really Indian? That is my first question. And secondly, when, after the 99-2000 dot-com collapse, there were a few companies which went burst, like, WorldCom and Tyco and all that. One of those companies was acquired by an Indian company. I think VSNL had acquired Tyco or something. I vaguely remember. So do we own many of these undersea cables? These are the two questions.
We don't own many companies that lay these cables. I mean, Tata does some work in this. Largely, Indian companies, their roles are restricted to A, securing landing permissions for these cables to come on shore, and B, therefore owning part of the bandwidth and being able to sell it on or to users or to other companies and so on. The main companies that lay cables out in open waters, there's one that's American called CCOM, there's one that's French called Alcatel, ASL they call it. There is one that's Malaysian called OMS, which is a very new entrant, and there's a Chinese company. These are 4, and maybe there's one I'm missing, I can't remember off the top of my head, but there's only 5 companies that lay cable in open waters, and only 2 of them are Asian. There is no Indian company that does that. To the first part of your question, I mean, I don't know the context in which Sunil Mittal said all this. It sounds like a bizarre excuse to say, we can't necessarily build roads everywhere, but our digital infrastructure is great. But digital infrastructure depends on a number of things. It's a very big, sort of category. You can think about, the fastest semiconductors, for example, and obviously those are not made in India. You can think about data center equipment, and maybe some of it is made in India, and maybe some of it is not. You can think about the online space in which, you have digital payments infrastructure like UPI and so on. So I'm a little unclear about the context in which he said it. But it's definitely true that for the field that I'm talking about, which is undersea cables and cabling of the internet in general, there are not any Indian companies who either manufacture cables of the highest quality, and definitely none that lay cables. Yeah, whoever has a mic.
Yeah? Okay. So, one thing, am I audible?
Yeah.
Hello, my name is Anjana. So, one thing I wanted to ask is that if you look at Congo, the country, cobalt mining is a big problem there, and the perpetrators of people who are forced into cobalt mining are also the big tech companies, right? So, when you speak about cables and the laying of cables, is there a human rights angle to that as well, which it's not something you've spoken about as much right now, but I just wanted to see if there was something here to look at.
Not from a mining perspective in that sense. But there is an interesting, if you consider the fact that the internet is so crucial to us right now that you could treat access to internet as a human right, maybe. I think it's definitely possible to make the case that if you're off the internet, your livelihood is likely to suffer or maybe not be as sort of advanced as if you were on the internet. So corresponding to that, what does happen is these tech companies who are laying 2 out of every 3 new cables and deciding what routes they take, it is essentially in their hands as to which countries get served by these cables and which don't. Let me give you one example. The longest cable right now anywhere is called To Africa, and it's owned by Facebook. They deny it, but most of the investment in there is from Facebook. And it comes from Cornwall in the UK, and it runs down the coast of West Africa, South Africa, comes up to the Middle East, and will eventually come to India. It has not fully been laid. So now when Meta lands a cable in a West African nation, it is able to go to Côte d'Ivoire, which is where I was, and say to them, look, you have only 3 cables coming ashore right now. We are going to give you a 4th. Your internet access will expand dramatically. All well and good. But then the Côte d'Ivoire government is in something of a quandary. You know, a lot of European nations have made this condition now with a lot of these tech firms saying, look, it's fine for you to operate in Europe, but consumer data of Europeans will live in European servers on European soil. Is the government of Côte d'Ivoire in the same position to exert that kind of leverage? The answer is no. They cannot say, look, we agree to this, but Facebook data should be stored on Ivorian soil. Otherwise, we don't want this cable. The answer is they're not in a position to say that. They need this cable much more than they're able to demand things from Meta. And so there is a huge imbalance between many parts of the world and the power of these tech companies and the leverage that they represent. You could think about that as a human rights angle, basically the right to privacy, the right to consumer data, and the safety of data. These are all huge issues that everybody is thinking about, but there's only some countries that are in a position to do anything about it and to wield any sort of power over these tech companies.
And while the mic is going there, just to add on to that, I mean, much is made of UPI as an interface that has democratized transactions, but I think there's a huge data angle to that is often not considered as much.
Hope I'm audible. Hi Samanth, hi Usha. So my question is more of a follow-up on the whole geopolitical aspect of the things that you said. I have a couple of questions interrelated. The first one being, so you mentioned about you gave the example about that African nation. Now, let's say that an American nation, most of the, as we know, most of the cables originate from European and American countries. But when it comes to natural resources, they will be as more cables get laid on, as they require more expansion, they are going to fall short of resources. And they will be relying on other countries on resources. For example, like let's look at the routes. Let's look at the line routes as well. Now, considering all of them, the power a nation has, the amount of leverage them as a nation has, and the amount of resources they have as well, how does it affect the jurisdiction of a cable line? Who owns it exactly? How is it falls under whose jurisdiction? Is it the company that laid it? Is it the place it was laid on?
Well, that's what I meant. I mean, a lot of these jurisdictional issues are not resolved. I mean, they are resolved if it's on territorial waters or if it's on the soil of a country. Then it's very clear. But the minute it goes out in international waters, jurisdictions are unclear. And often a cable has many owners. Often, almost always a cable lands in multiple places. So jurisdictions are difficult to resolve, and nobody's actually figured out how to solve this riddle.
So there isn't a fundamental series of rules and laws that need to be adhered to while deciding the jurisdiction.
No, I mean, no, there isn't, basically. Short answer, no. Not about the physicality of these cables in the ocean, there isn't, yeah.
Thank you. Another question, actually. A lot of this conversation has created...
Do we have any other questions?
Yeah, let's do one question per person, because I think there's a lot of people who want to ask things.
Hi. So just for a young researcher or somebody curious for this topic, what's a good online resource that maps these undersea cables globally where we could sort of look for our own connections or interesting
there's a great map if you just Google submarine cables,
Submarine
cables, I think it must be the first thing that comes up. It's an interactive map. You can go to all the places where it lands. You can click on those places. You can click on the cables and see sort of who laid it, when it was laid, how much how much investment was in that cable. It is entirely interactive, entirely free and public.
Okay, thank you. Does it go back in time as well?
No, I don't think so. I think it's just a current. There are about around, I think 500-ish cables that land now, that are around now. But it is also,
Like, if I were to map South Asian connectivity from the 70s, from the 90s to now.
from the 90s.
Yeah.
I don't think it offers that facility. Yeah, yeah. I don't think there's any historic. Sorry? Oh, maybe, yeah. Maybe if you go to the Internet Archive, maybe it will have snapshots from back in time. Those won't be interactive, they'll just be static. But you can look at the images maybe. Yeah, thank you.
I think back there, we have 2 questions. Do we have time for 2? I think the rest of the questions we'll have to take offline. Yes.
All the answers to almost all of your questions are in the book, which you will buy in April.
So, hi Samanth, I'm audible? Yeah. So my question is, what's going to replace this infrastructure?
Sorry?
What's going to replace this large infrastructure? Because
Okay.
people are always building something new, something better, something reliable.
Okay, and let's take the other question also and I'll reply to both of them.
Yeah, thank you so much for this, Samanth. My question's a little trickier with regards to formats and structures. So a couple of years ago, Meta in its data center had decided they will change the rack size of the data center and in the process allow things to happen. So one of my friends, Alex, who studies digital media infrastructures, started celebrating about it because he called it the biggest shift in infrastructure studies in probably 20 years. My question with undersea cables is something similar. So with the number of cables out there and the fact that they're across multiple timelines and stuff, how exactly is the formatting kind of happening? How are the cables talking to each other?
Okay. So for the first question, in the foreseeable future, nobody expects a replacement of cables as the primary carrier of information. Our appetite for information is only going to expand. Satellites are not yet at the stage where they can, at a cost-efficient way, process all of this information. People have tried a lot of things. There's half a chapter in my book about this thing called Google Loon, which is Google's attempt to send balloons into the stratosphere and bounce data signals between them. They abandoned that project, but even that project was ultimately reliant on cables because the signals would come back down to Earth, go to a ground station, and travel under the sea. So, short answer, nothing. We are wedded to cables for the foreseeable future. For the other question, which is a little bit more complex, I'm not entirely sure about the what happens on the land side, basically how these cables talk to each other, I'm not sure. But there's been a number of other kind of like similar shifts in development or quantum leaps in development of the technology that are very interesting. One of them is called wave division multiplexing, which is relatively speaking not that old a technology, and it enables sort of light to be broken down into individual wavelengths, and each wavelength can then carry a particular strand of information, and then they can be kind of like rejigged at the other end to read all that information and condense all of that back into a stream of traffic. I thought that was enormously interesting. The other thing is like just a kind of, as you make the glass fibers in the fiber optic cable ever thinner and simultaneously more capable of carrying information, there are these things called fiber pairs. Basically, one fiber goes in this, sends traffic in this direction, and the other fiber in the pair brings it in this direction. So they're able to fit ever more fiber pairs into a single cable under the sea. So now they're talking of 64 fiber pairs, whereas earlier they used to have like 4 or 8 or 12. So that is what people are excited about now. 64 fiber pairs in a cable under the sea is apparently going to be a huge jump in how much bandwidth a cable has. So those are the things on the undersea cable front I can talk about. I'm not entirely. The other thing also that people keep talking about as a kind of pipe dream is the shift to what we call IPv6. There's a little bit of that in my book, but that is largely a kind of land side shift that has to happen. It's an internet protocol technology that gives you many more IP addresses around the world, and it's more complex than I can even understand sometimes. But that is the essential quality to it, and that is apparently supposed to make for a more secure internet. But that, again, is something that happens on the land side, not the sea side.
Okay, I think with that we've come to the end, but if you're okay, answering a few questions offline. I think people can talk to you. Unfortunately, we don't have a book signing because the book isn't available yet. But thank you so much for your attention, and thank you, Samanth.
Thank you everyone for coming.